God above, set apart for the one we love, set apart for your glory. We are yours, yours. Sacred and holy, your name is worthy. Jesus, awaken our hearts now to be your revival. Set apart for a God above, set apart for the one we love, set apart for your glory. We are yours, yours. Set apart for a God.
That happens too much. Hey, how are you guys? You guys good? Good. It is so good to see you guys, man. It is Mother's Day. Who has not gone to Walmart yet? Don't raise your hand because you will be outed, right? I was at Walmart with my kids. We were at Sam's actually last night getting gifts, last night about 9 o'clock at night. So if you haven't got it yet, I'm only like 12 hours in front of you. So it's okay. That's just the thought that counts, not the timing of the thought, right? We are in week 2 of our series, Set Apart. Last week, if you remember, we started a series on a guy named Moses, where we looked at who he was, what God is starting to call him to, and the very first thing we talked about was that when God calls you to something bigger than who you are, right, it is going to be a testing of your faith because the devil all of a sudden has a bullseye on your back. And we talked about last week how the devil is a roaring lion. We talked about the fact that a roaring lion has a roar that can be heard 5 miles away. We talked about the fact that a roar of a lion is 114 decibels, 25 times louder than the average lawnmower. And sometimes when the devil roars, all we hear is the devil. And the goal of the devil is that he would get in your life in such a way, so loudly, so bluntly, so aggressively, that you would be unable to hear the voice of God. Right now, God may be calling you in your life to something huge. And it could be that right now in your life, you're not hearing it because the devil is yelling so loud. And so last week we talked about how do we quiet the devil? This week we're going to take another step and we're going to look at what happens when God calls you to something huge, okay? Now, I want to quantify what huge means. Let me ask you a question before I do though. How many of you would say, without raising your hand, just tell it to yourself, you would say right now in this moment, God has called me, or he's called my family, or he's called, my calling, or something in your life to a God-sized moment. Right now, I am in the midst of something God-sized. God has called me specifically to. I remember about 5 years ago, it's going to be 5 years ago, September 8th, that we finally answered the prayer to come here and plant this church and come to this dirty car dealership that was shut down for like 7 years. When we walked in, it was a dusty, nasty mess. It was gross. We were jackhammering. We were doing all kinds of stuff in hopes that people would show up. This thing was so much bigger than us. We had no idea how we were going to draw people. We went and bought a house on faith, not knowing if we were going to be able to afford it. I mean, everything that we did was bigger than us. Let me ask you a question. What have you done lately for God that is just bigger than you? Because let me make a really clear statement. If you're not doing something in your life that is God-sized, that is bigger than you, then you may not at this point in your life be doing anything for God. Whew. That's a heavy statement, isn't it? And you can look at me and you can go, well, Matt, not everybody's called to ministry. Not everybody's called to start a church. You're absolutely right. You want to know my first bigger than God bigger than me moment? I was sitting in Springfield, Missouri at Second Baptist Springfield when Elvis Presley's stepbrother stood up and started sharing the gospel. And my mom and my dad, I look at them and I said, I need to go forward and give my life to Jesus. And I put my hand at 7 years old in my dad's hand, and we walked this aisle that seemed massive to me. It seemed overwhelming to me. I was so scared. I was shaking in my boots going, is this aisle ever going to end? Just let me get to the end. And I remember going down on the side and just sitting down with this teenage girl who led me through what it meant to know Jesus. That was my first bigger than Matt moment. Right? One of my second bigger than Matt moments was I was on a trailer park curb. I was some kid who thought he was going to play professional baseball. That's a joke, but that's what I thought. And God had moved me to Troy, Missouri and put me in a youth group with a guy named Bob Feeler who taught me how to share my faith. I was in O'Fallon, Missouri on a trailer park curb when a little boy walks up and I shared my faith with him for the very first time. I remember how terrified I was, how unprepared I felt, how I felt like nothing was gonna come out of my mouth correctly, and yet I'm going, okay, God, if this is what you want me to do, I'm gonna do it, and blah. And I led a little boy to Christ. I remember standing in the church and going, okay, God, what's next for me? And God calling me to ministry. I remember when God said, I don't want you to go to the University of Arkansas and play baseball. I want you to go to Hannibal LaGrange that no one's heard of, and I want you to major in ministry. And these are all moments that are not Matt-sized. They're moments that are God-sized. I remember when I had the boy who just led you in worship. And I prayed. That God would just make him a godly man. That God would use him in a mighty way. And I remember thinking how that's so much bigger than me. Because I'm just, at the end of the day, that's not that great. You know, I screw up, I make mistakes, I do all these different things that just aren't worthy of God. And how in the world am I gonna be able to raise up a boy that's gonna be godly? And now I got 5, and I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, not just 1. Now I gotta do that 5 times? I mean, 1 out of 5 ain't bad, but how am I gonna do 5 out of 5? And it just seems so much bigger than me. It's not just about calling into ministry. It's about calling to be the father you're called to be, or the mother you're called to be, or walking into a job that you don't feel like you can handle on your own, because God has called you and put you there, and you're there because he wants you to be there, and you're being obedient. And again, I ask you, is there something in your life that you're doing in such a way right now that if God does not come through, it will not happen? Because if you're not doing anything God-sized in your life, then maybe God isn't as in your life as you thought he was. So what we're gonna talk about today, what we're gonna look at today is this: that if you're not doing something that is bigger than you, that is God-sized in your life, why not? Let's look at why not. Let's answer it. Let's see what God does when he does what he does when you give him the ability to. And let's come to some answers. If you got your Bibles, go to the book of Exodus. We're going to be in chapter 3 today. We're going to be looking at this person in the midst of the text named Moses. We've talked about him. I told you last week as we looked at Moses, Moses was a guy who at the time of his birth was a gentleman as a baby that was grown up in a home where Pharaoh was going out and he was killing all the babies. And his mom sticks him in the river, and the daughter of the Pharaoh picks him up, and he's raised in the palace. And as he's raised in the palace, he gets to the age where he's an adult and he knows he's a Hebrew, and he sees the abuse of the Egyptians on the Hebrews, and he sees specifically one person beating up one of the Hebrew men, and he murders him and buries him in the sand. Because as we said last week, sometimes the devil roars so loud that we do things we're not proud of. And he finds himself in exile out in the middle of the woods tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro for 40-some years. Because again, we said, when we hear the roar of the lion and we respond to it, sometimes it puts us off course for years because we listen to it. And now you're gonna find 40 years later, Moses is gonna have an encounter with God, and God's gonna come back in his life and he's gonna go, Moses, I have something bigger than you that I want you to do. Are you ready? And here's what it looks like. Chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame out of fire in the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, that bush was burning, yet as it burned, it just didn't consume up. It didn't go to char, it didn't go to black. And Moses said, I'm gonna turn around and see what that is. And when the Lord saw that he turned to him, God called him out of the bush. Hey, Moses, Moses. Here I am, he said. Do not come near me, Moses. Take off your sandals of your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now, before we go any further, I know what some of you are thinking. Man, I am all about doing God-sized things if God burns a bush in my yard. That I'll know that God's in it, man. You know, it's so hard sometimes to understand and to detect the place of God in my life. I have a hard time seeing him. I have a hard time understanding him. I have a hard time knowing when he's really calling me to something. And if God burnt my burning bush in the yard or he burnt my rose bush in the yard, oh, dude, I am all over that. Can I be honest with you for a moment? Let's just be real. In my life, God has burned bushes every year I've been alive. God burns bushes in a lot of different ways. He burns bushes through people who come to me and say, hey, Matt, you need to change your life. He's burned bushes through my parents who've looked at me and said, hey, I knew you were called to what you're called to. He's burned bushes in my life when he put a woman in my life who made me a better person and called me to more. He burned bushes in my life when he put me in a church and called me to raise up a generation of people who would be about adoption. He's burned a lot of bushes in my life, and I'll bet in your life he's burned a lot of bushes too. Here's the question. Do you answer the quest of the burning bush in your life? I think a lot of Christians, as they walk through life, they get a lot of burning bushes and they go, it's really cool, God, but no way. No, that's not me. I'm not able to do that. And here's what you're going to find as you look at the text today. You are no different than one of the greatest people that was written about in the Bible named Moses. He was a no way guy, even in the midst of seeing a burning bush. Then the Lord said, Moses, this is verse 7, I've seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to a place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, anything even ending in ites. I want them there. That's what he's saying. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've seen their oppression, which the Egyptians oppressed them with. Look at this. God says, I have come down to take care of them. Don't miss this. I've come down to take care of them, God says. And then he says, come on, Moses, I'm going to send you. And if I'm Moses, I'm going, hang on a minute. You just said you've come down to take care of them. Why do I need to go? Right? And Moses kind of says that. If you look at this, here's what he's going to say. Come, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I? Let me ask you a question. Has God ever called you to something bigger than you and you said, dude, there's no way. Do you know me? I mean, I've been trying to get over this addiction for years. Do you know who I am? There is no way. I have failed over and over and over again. You want me to have a healthy relationship? I come from a family that's been divorced umpteen times. How am I going to have a healthy relationship? Who am I? Man, you want me to follow you with my whole heart? You want me to raise my kids? Look at the generational sin in our home. There's no way that I can do that. Look at the pressures I feel. God, how can you ask me to do something like that? How can you ask me to give? I mean, we're so broke right now. How can you ask me to adopt? Our home is so full. We feel so overwhelmed. How can you ask something bigger than me? Who am I? That's what Moses is saying. And I think for all of us at times, we have a who am I moment. But can I tell you who he is? Because here's the thing. God is speaking loudly and clearly and in a magnificent way in the life of Moses right now. And Moses is missing it. Because go back. Before Moses says, who am I? Look what God says. If you'll do me a favor, guys, up in the top. Go to verse 6. Moses says, who am I? But before Moses says, who am I? Here's what God says. I am the God of your father and his father and his father and his father. And you can go back and look at their stories, Moses, and you can see what I did for them, and I'm ready to do the same thing through you. You see, so many times God calls you to something, you go, who am I? How in the world am I going to accomplish that? You are not going to accomplish that. God is. God is the one who will carry you. God is the one who will restore your marriage. God is the one who will take a smart aleck punk butt kid and stick him on a stage as a preacher when everybody in high school would have told you he was the biggest jerk in the school. God does those things. God takes addictions out of a person's life. God removes that desire for alcohol. God takes you out of your sexual addictions. God is the one who will fix what is broken in you, who will take you to that next level, who will put you where he has called you to be. And it won't be because you have these special feet that can get you there. It will be because God puts you there. And the problem is, we are still convinced in our lives that it is us who gets us there. And it's not. It is God. And for a long time, maybe in some of your lives, God is calling you to something bigger, and you go, who am I? I'll tell you, it's not who you are, it is whose you are that makes the difference. Do you believe that? Let me tell you something. The people who believe that are the people who really accomplish amazing things for God. And you know what's amazing about that? Is every single time God does something in my life, right? And he comes through, and I trust him, and I don't say, who am I, God? But I say, what are you capable of, God? Let's go do this thing. He builds my faith. You know, some of you guys, I know when I told you that we're going to plant another church in Harvester, you're like, why would he do that? Man, I mean, what in the world? I mean, we just got this building built. Why don't we take a breath? Why don't we stop? Why don't we just relax? Why don't we just build this one? Why do we need to go there? It makes no sense. Why would he want to do that? Because I want to live in a it's bigger than me moment. Because I want you to live in a bigger than me moment. I want you to be so out of control of what could happen in this church that if we try to touch it, it would fail. But if God holds it, it will thrive. You know why I want to do that in front of you? So that you will go home and do that in front of your children. We've got to do things that are bigger than us. We've got to do things that are God-sized, because if we don't do things God-sized, we're just doing it like us. And man, there's been a lot of people that have done things man-sized the entirety of the world, and they have failed over and over. Started with Adam and Eve in the garden when they ate the apple. That was a God-sized moment. I've got a lot of God-sized moments, or man-sized moments, back up. I got a lot of man-sized moments. I want God-sized moments. Don't you? I'm tired of being the author of my faith. I want God to be the author of my faith. Because as I've said before, he writes a better story than me. Now Moses, if we get into chapter 3, verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What am I going to say? Now, here's a time, I got to be honest with you, where I kind of relate to Moses, where he goes, okay, God, this is basically what he was going. God, I understand you want me to go to them and tell them that you're going to let them go, but who's going to believe me that I was in the middle of the woods and I saw a bush and it was on fire and I went over to it and it spoke to me? They're not going to listen to me. They're going to commit me, okay? They're going to put me in a home and they're going to give me medicine and tell me I'm too stressed out. Because nobody goes in the middle of the woods and sees a bush on fire and listens to it and it talks back to them. God looks at him and goes, I know this is bigger than you, Moses, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to your people and I want you to tell them the God of your fathers, because they need to remember what their fathers experienced with me, because they have forgotten that. I want you to make sure you go say, the I am, who is the God of your fathers, is calling you out of Egypt into a land of milk and honey. He's going to put you in a place that's better than you. And not only that, I'm going to put calamity on the men of Egypt in such a way that they have to let you go. And not only that, I'm going to give you their stuff. And not because I kill them, but because they're going to hand it to you. Dude, it is going to be a sign of signs. Now don't miss this. God said this to the very end of this verse. He goes, but you're going to know this because when this is all over, you're going to serve me on this very mountain. In this moment, don't miss this. This is really important, and I'm not sure how to articulate it, just being real honest, but I want you to get this, okay? I think there are moments in our life when God is most impressed with you when he doesn't need to give you a bunch of signs. I think God is most marveled by you. There's 2 times in the Bible when God says he was marveled by people. The one time he said he was marveled was in the marveling of a man's faith when a centurion came up to him and said, "You don't know me, I don't know you, but I've seen you, and I got a person that's sick, and I don't even want you to come to my house. If you just tell me you'll heal him, I'll believe that. I'll leave you alone, and I'll go back." And God goes, "Wow, there's nobody in Israel like this guy." And he marveled at him. There's another time in which he went home to minister to his people, and they didn't want him in their town, and they kicked him out. And he said, "You know what? A man just cannot go home." And he marveled at that fact. God marvels at the lack of faith or at the immense of faith, okay? Now watch this. I think in this moment with Moses, if Moses would have went, "Yeah, let's do this," we would have had a third marvel in here. We would have had a third moment in which God went, "Wow, that didn't take much. This dude's ready to go." Let me ask you a hard question. Does God marvel at your faith? Either positively or negatively. Is God amazed at the way you rise to his call? Or is God amazed at the way that you continue to reside in your seat when he calls? There are times, I gotta be honest with you, when God has marveled at how I reside in my seat. And then there are times when God has marveled at how I've gotten up and I've rose to the occasion and been who he's called me to be. And I'm telling you right now in your life, in the life of our church as it pertains to this place that we're going, we have got to rise from our seats so that God will marvel on North Road Church. So that he will marvel on your family, because when he marvels, I mean, think about it. When God marvels, you are moving the heart of the Almighty God. You're moving the heart of the God of the universe. God has seen everything, been everywhere, done everything. There can't be a lot that marvels him. But when I say yes, God is marveled. You would think in this moment as I'm playing that up that God, the next thing it would say was, Moses said, "Absolutely." Well, here's what Moses says, chapter 4, verse 1. Then Moses answered, "But God," anything that starts with the but ain't good, right? She has a pretty face, but, right? I mean, you know, he's a really nice guy, but. I mean, I really like that person, but. Anything that ends with a but or starts with a but, not good, right? Then Moses answered, "But God, they will not believe or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" In other words, again, we go back to, "But God," here we go again. "You want me to tell them that there was a bush on fire that was talking to me?" That's not gonna happen. And at that moment, he goes, "Do me a favor, Moses. Take that staff in your hand and chuck it on the ground." And Moses chucks it on the ground, and immediately it was a snake. That's enough for me right there. I'm done. Check, please. Right? Anybody else? I cannot stand snakes. If that happened, I'd be like, "Get somebody else, God, I'm out." Right? He goes, "Now, Moses, grab it by the tail." And Moses grabs it by the tail, and immediately it's a stick again. The next thing he says is, "Hey, Moses, take your right hand and stick it inside your cloak." Well, okay. Sticks it in his cloak, pulls it out, and it is white, leprous with sores. And he goes, "That's nasty." I'm sure. I mean, I'm just, paraphrasing. That's what I would say. That's nasty. But it would also be like, wow, look what God can do. And God says, "Now stick it back in and pull it back out." And he does it again, and it's healed again. He goes, "Hey, one more thing I want you to do, Moses. I want you to go to the Nile River, and I want you to get some water out of it. And if they don't believe you, I want you to pour it on the ground. And the moment you pour it on the ground, it will turn to human blood." Now, at this moment, right, you would think Moses would go, "That's enough for me, man. Let's go do this thing." But let's be honest, can we? You've had some God moments in your life, haven't you? Where God showed up so clear, where God was just so relevant and so prevalent in you who you are, where you just stood in a moment and you went, "Wow, this is totally a God thing." I've had those moments, right? So how come those moments don't sustain me? Because I'm a human sometimes. Moses is just a human. Man, notice this. For those of you that are sitting in here going, "Man, I have avoided God-sized moments." Moses is one of the biggest characters in all of the Bible, and he is avoiding God-sized moments. It is human nature. So God does all those things, and here's Moses' response, verse 10. But Moses says to the Lord, "God, I'm not a good talker. That's what he says. Do you see that? He goes, God, I'm not a good talker. Stop for a moment. How out of touch are you with God right now to say I'm not a good talker? Do you need to talk? All you gotta do is throw the stick down, man, right? All you gotta do is put your hand in your coat, man, and you'll be fine. You don't need to talk. Man, go get some water, dump it on the ground. That says much enough. But he says, and he looks at me and he goes, I know that's not good English, is it? But we're in Lincoln County and it's okay. That's much enough. Anybody in here, this is a little off. My kids tease me all the time because I will say yesterday night. Is that so weird? Well, yesterday night, I was thinking you were weird too. So, anyway. So Moses looks at him and he goes, man, I'm not eloquent. I don't have the ability to talk. God says, I don't need you to talk. And then the real heart of it comes out. And you don't want to miss the real heart of it because here's what it is. Verse 13. Can you pull that up for me? Verse 13. But Moses said to God, God, just get somebody else. To me, that's crushing. Because I think of the moments in time in which God had called me to something so much bigger than myself, and I just looked at him and I said, God, just get somebody else. God, I'm not ready for this moment. Get somebody else. God, I'm not capable in this moment. Get somebody else. Because what he is saying is, God, not I'm not capable. God, I don't believe you're capable. God, I don't care if I stuck my hand in my coat and it came out with sores. I don't care that I threw a stick down and it became a snake. I don't care that I poured water on the ground and it became blood. I don't care that you preached to me through a bush. I mean, come on. I am not your guy. I don't believe I am capable. And what it is it's a lack of a belief that he thinks God will go before him. Do you believe in your life that if God calls you to something God-sized, that he will go before you? Because if you don't, you will constantly look at him and say, no, get someone else. And here's what I just love you to do in this moment. You don't have to bow your head or anything, but if you're in this moment and you're going, man, that's me. Just under your breath go, God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that for so many years I've told you get someone else. At this moment in time, for the very first moments of it, Moses comes in and he goes, who am I, God? I mean, I'm not really this guy. How are they going to believe me, God? I'm not sure that I can make them listen. Man, God, I'm not so eloquent, right? And then he finally looks at God and he goes, God, just get somebody else. And for the very first time, God gets angry, right? We're going through this thing in our home right now with our kids. And here's what I tell my kids all the time. I don't care how good you are at something. I don't care that you are the best on the field or the worst on the field. I don't care if you play the star position or the not star position. I don't care if records are written about you. But here's what I care about. That when you walk out on the field, that you give it everything you possibly have for me, for you. Because it means something to give your best. And man, we go round and round. We have these conversations all the time. Did you feel like you gave your best today? Are you giving your best today? Come on, man, you got to hustle. You got to do this. And we talk about just when you walk out there, give everything you got. Let everything else play it out. Man, if you look at Moses in this moment, he's just jogging out the sprint. God had called him just to give everything he had. Who am I? You don't have to be anything. It's not who you are, it's whose you are. Just walk. And he's like, man, I'm not doing it. And for the very first time, God gets angry. That's a hard thought, that the God of the universe would be angry at me. I've had some pretty big, intimidating people angry at me before. Had one yesterday on the highway. He told me hi in not such a nice way. That didn't bother me so much, but if the God of the universe is angry at me, oh my gosh. Where are you and God at in your relationship? Would you say he's angry? Because you know specifically what he wants from you and you have told him no? Let me ask you this question. Why are you telling him no? Is it because you're basing everything more on who you are than who he is? Finally, God looks at him and goes, great. If you don't want everything that I've got planned for you, if you don't want me to be the author of your faith, then let's try to mar it a little bit and use some of your ideas. We'll go get your brother Aaron, and your brother Aaron can speak for you, but I'm not letting you out of this moment, Moses. Some of you in this room today, because God is not going to let you out of your moment. He is going to call you to what you've been called to do. And today for you may be a huge reminder to get off the bench and be who he's called you to be. And so Moses and Aaron, they step up to Pharaoh and they look at him. And they say, hey, Pharaoh. And if you want to look at it in your Bibles, it's chapter 5. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is God that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? And then he looks at him and he goes, and you know what? Moses and Aaron, because you came to me today, you're wasting their time. They're our slaves. They're busy, and you are being burdensome to the time that they're spending. We don't need to waste this time. And he calls out to his people and he says, you know what? Take the straw away from them, let them find their own straw and make the same amount of bricks, because good old Moses and Aaron came today. And if I'm Moses and Aaron in this moment, I'm going, I knew I shouldn't have went, right? Isn't that you? I knew I shouldn't have went in this moment. I shouldn't have trusted God. God wasn't really there. I saw that bush. Shouldn't have ate that stuff that night before, because that caused me to see some weird stuff. I mean, all these thoughts are going through your head. But don't miss this. It's my favorite verse in the entire story of Moses. You ready? Chapter 6, verse 1. To give you a little bit of catch up, Moses goes to God and he goes, what are you doing? You came out in the middle of the woods, you burned a bush. You told me that I'm gonna go. You showed me the snake, the leprous, and the blood. And I told you I wasn't eloquent. I told you I wasn't ready for this moment. And this just confirms it, God. What are you doing? And God makes this statement, which I think is the most powerful statement in the entire account of the story. But God said to Moses, now, but now, Moses, you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. You see, Moses, I had to set up the moment. I had to make it look like there's nothing that you could do to fix it, because Moses, if you walked in the moment and said, let the people go, and he looked at you and he said, okay, that doesn't seem very godlike. But Moses, now that you've been obedient, now that you haven't said, who am I? Now that you haven't blamed your speech, now that you haven't came up with 100 different reasons why not to do this, now that you've walked in and it seems completely hopeless, I'm here to tell you there is hope, because just watch what I'm going to do to Pharaoh in this moment. I'm going to bring him to his knees. Some of you have been fighting addiction for so long, and God has just asked you to come to the table in repentance and ask him to fix it. And because of the calamity of it and the destruction it's caused in your life, you feel completely hopeless, and you're going, where are you, God? And he goes, if you will just trust me, I will take your Pharaoh down. How am I supposed to do this job, God? It is so much bigger than me. Trust me, I will take your Pharaoh down. God, how am I supposed to raise these kids and make them godly? I'm not even being godly myself right now. Submit to me, and I will take your Pharaoh down. What is God calling you to? Is it bigger than you? Because if it's not, then you're probably just living man-sized stories, and you are missing it because you are afraid of the conflict. But there is no greatness that comes out of just pleasure all the time. Diamonds are refined when they're pressed. Women have babies when they hurt. Why? Because something beautiful always comes out of something painful. And I would just challenge you right now in this moment, stop being afraid of what might hurt, because it's not who you are and what you can handle, but it's whose you are and what he can do. God changed all of Egypt. and Israel because of one man who just said, okay, let's go. Some of you sit in a moment right now, don't you? You know exactly what God has called you to do. You know exactly what God is asking for you next. Maybe it's to give your life to Him, and you have fought Him because, man, I have to go home and tell my family, and that's not going to make sense to them, and I'm going to look like a nut, and oh my gosh. Some of you, you know, you're overwhelmed with your kids or your marriage or your job or your problems or your integrity, or maybe you're so angry at somebody right now that you just can't let it go, and to let it go would just so hurt you. But God is on the other side, just waiting to take your Pharaoh down. Will you let Him do that? Last thing I want to say. God didn't have to use Moses, and God doesn't have to use you. He chooses to, so that you'll look like Him. It is these moments that make you look more like Him. When I lost my job in Raytown and I was living in my basement in the fetal position, depressed because I had lost it, it was in those moments that God made me look like Him. When I came here and I had nothing and had no idea how we were going to do this and everything resided on Him, it was in these moments that I looked more like Him. I will never look like Him living a comfortable earthly life that is not God-sized. So if you're living earthly, man-sized life, stop it. And be who God is calling you to be. Will you bow your head and close your eyes for just a second? Jesus, I just ask in this moment as the band comes out to play, as we sing this song of reflection, that God, we would reflect on our own lives, that God, we would become who You've called us to be, and that Father, we would start living God-sized moments and stop living these small little man-sized moments. Because God, You are so much bigger than that, and You are ready to take Pharaohs down with our hands if we'll just be obedient.